The kingdom lay between mountains that looked like sleeping gods, their faces carved by centuries of wind and silence. Every stone, every rule, every gaze carried weight. It was a place where obedience was worshipped, and questioning was a crime whispered about only when the moon hid its face. They called it the Kingdom of Stone and Silence, not because the land was barren, but because the hearts of its rulers had long turned cold. Palaces glittered with gold dust, yet the air was heavy with fear, a fear that had shaped generations into servants of tradition. At the heart of this kingdom rose a tower so tall it touched the clouds. Built of black granite and silver veins, it pierced the sky like a blade aimed at the heavens. The people said it was a divine eye, the god's way of watching over those who strayed from obedience. But others, the old women who still remembered the songs of freedom, whispered that the tower was cursed, that it fed on the voices of those silenced by power. It was both a monument of punishment and an altar of unseen truth. Inside the palace, the king ruled with a voice that cracked like thunder. He was a man whose fear wore the mask of wisdom. Prophecies had always haunted his bloodline, tales that one day, power would not be inherited by sword or crown but by voice. So when his daughter was born under the shrouded sky of an eclipse, his joy curdled into dread. The midwives trembled as they laid the child in his arms. Her name was Zuri, meaning the one who brings light, but the king saw only shadow. For when she opened her mouth to cry, the wind outside rose as if answering her. Curtains flared, lamps flickered, and a cold breath swept through the room. The court priest gasped and fell to his knees, murmuring that this was no ordinary child. Days later, the royal seer, an old man whose eyes were white as moonlight, came to the king in the dead of night. His voice carried the weight of countless secrets as he spoke. From the highest tower will rise the one who commands both wind and word. Her tongue will move nations and her breath will shake the throne. The king's heart pounded like war drums. To him, prophecy was not destiny, it was a warning. He saw not a daughter but a threat clothed in innocence. Fear made him cruel. He ordered that the child be taken from her mother and raised in isolation, away from court, away from song, away from the world. The queen's pleas were silenced, her tears forbidden. And so, before Zuri could even speak her first words, she was carried beneath the shadow of the tower, that dark pillar of silence. As the doors closed behind her, the king convinced himself that he had secured his reign. But the wind outside sighed through the valley, curling around the stones as if whispering a promise, that walls cannot contain what was born of the sky. They brought her to the tower before she could even remember the shape of her mother's face. The path to it wound up the side of a gray hill, lined with spears and armored men whose faces never softened. The tower loomed above them all, its narrow windows like watching eyes. The villagers gathered below, clutching their children close, whispering prayers that the cursed child's shadow would not fall upon their homes. When the soldiers passed, mothers turned their faces away, and elders spat into the dust to ward off misfortune. "She is the one born beneath the dying sun," they murmured. "The wind follows her cry." Others whispered that even the gods feared her voice. And so Zuri, a child barely old enough to walk, became the kingdom's secret, hidden in plain sight. Her name was no longer spoken in the palace. Her existence was erased from records and songs. Only the guards at the base of the hill remembered her as the little girl who stared silently through iron bars, her eyes bright as stormlight. The tower was a cold teacher. Its stones breathed with the chill of centuries, whispering their stories through cracks and echoes. Zuri grew up among the hum of wind and the flutter of wings. Birds came and went, sparrows, doves, sometimes black crows that lingered as though they recognized her. She would speak to them, her small voice echoing against the walls, shaping words into rhythm and rhyme. She found that when she sang softly, the wind outside shifted, curling through her window as if answering her. At first, she feared the emptiness, the endless echo of her own breathing. But slowly she learned to listen, not just with her ears but with her bones. The tower was alive in its own way. When she pressed her ear to the wall, she could hear faint thuds deep within the stone, as though the heart of the mountain itself still beat there. She began to hum in tune with it, matching her breath to its pulse until her voice became part of the tower's rhythm. The years slipped by like mist. The king never visited. His soldiers brought her food and water without meeting her eyes. Sometimes at night she would climb to the window and watch the flickering lights of the city below. She imagined the lives of those tiny glowing figures. Laughter, music, the sound of drums at festivals. The air would carry faint melodies to her, and she would whisper them back to the wind, reshaping them into something her own. As she grew, so did her curiosity. She began to scratch symbols into the wall, words she invented, shapes she felt were part of her. The tower, though made to confine, slowly became her world, her teacher, her silent friend. It taught her patience through its stillness, strength through its endurance. She learned the language of shadows, the way light crept through cracks at dawn, and the way the wind changed tone when storms approached. Sometimes she would lie flat on the cold floor, eyes closed, and imagine the world beyond. Her fingers would trace invisible paths in the air, the curves of rivers she'd never seen, the shapes of trees described in old guard whispers. She dreamed of the day she might walk free, though even her dreams trembled at the thought. In her loneliness, she began to speak to the air as if it were alive. And sometimes, when her voice quivered, a faint breeze brushed her cheek as though answering her sorrow. The wind, gentle and faithful, became her only friend. It carried her whispers into the endless blue sky, secrets, hopes, small songs of defiance. By the time Zuri reached her 16th year, she no longer feared the tower. The place that had been built to silence her had instead taught her to listen. She no longer saw its stones as chains, but as veins of memory, pulsing with the breath of every soul who had ever been forgotten. The wind was her mother, the walls her guardians. And though she was locked away, her spirit had already begun to reach beyond them. You said. The years passed like drifting clouds, marked not by seasons but by the rhythm of Zuri's breath and the hum of the tower that had become her world. Her hair grew long, her voice grew deeper, and her eyes learned to read the shadows that danced on the stone walls. She no longer feared the silence, she had made peace with it. Yet one night, when the moon hung low and heavy over the horizon, that silence broke. It began as a faint murmur, like the wind whispering secrets through a crack. Zuri had been sitting by her window, tracing the stars with her fingertip, when she heard it, a sound not of nature but of voice. She froze, her heart pounding, listening again. The sound came from within the wall itself, soft, trembling, like a sigh buried in stone. At first, she thought loneliness had finally begun to twist her mind. But then the voice grew clearer, an old woman's whisper, sorrowful yet calm. "Do not fear, child of the wind," it breathed. "We have waited long for your ears to open." Zuri pressed her ear to the cold wall, her breath shallow. The stones were vibrating, faintly alive beneath her palms. She whispered back, asking who they were, what they wanted. The answer came not from one but many, a chorus of voices rising from the depths. They spoke in fragments, overlapping like echoes trapped in time. "We are those who came before, the ones buried not in earth but in silence. We healed when they forbade us to speak. We ruled when they said women could not rule. We sang until they walled our voices away. The tower was not hollow, it was full of memory. Each stone had absorbed centuries of grief and strength, the essence of every woman who had been locked there before her." Zuri closed her eyes and felt their energy thrumming beneath her skin, a low, steady heartbeat that matched her own. Night after night she returned to listen. The walls became her storytellers, her ancestors in spirit. They told her of queens whose wisdom had threatened kings, of healers accused of witchcraft because they understood nature too deeply, of poets whose words had moved the hearts of soldiers. Each had been brought to this same tower, condemned for power they were never meant to wield. One voice stood out among them, calm, regal, with the tone of a leader. She called herself Amira, the first woman ever imprisoned there. "I was a queen before the tower had a name," she said. "They feared my knowledge of the skies, of the stars that guided men but answered to me. So they built this prison and made it a shrine, hoping to bury the truth within its stones. But truth, child, is not buried. It sleeps, waiting to be woken by the right voice." Zuri's nights became lessons. Amira and the others taught her forgotten languages, the rhythm of chants, the breath patterns that called the wind, the tones that could bend flame or stir the air. Zuri repeated them softly at first, unsure, but each time she did, the tower seemed to breathe with her. Torches flickered when she exhaled, dust spiraled in patterns that looked like symbols. In the beginning she thought it was coincidence. But one night, as she sang an old chant taught by the walls, the wind outside rose and swirled into her chamber, lifting her hair and extinguishing her candles. The air shimmered with energy, and for the first time she understood, she was not just hearing the tower. She was awakening it. The voices grew stronger as her faith deepened. They told her where cracks had formed, how roots from the mountain below intertwined with the foundation, how sound traveled through stone like water. Zuri began experimenting, humming low tones that made dust fall, high notes that caused the floor to tremble faintly. But more than power, they gave her belonging. She was no longer alone, she was part of something ancient, a sisterhood woven through time and silence. The tower had not been her cage, it was a vessel, carrying their memories until she was ready to inherit them. As the moonlight touched her face one night, Amira's voice came again, soft but commanding. "Zuri, the tower remembers your blood. You are not the first, but you must be the last. They will try again to bury the storm, but this time, the wind will not be tamed." Zuri pressed her hands flat against the wall, tears streaking down her cheeks. For the first time she whispered, "I am listening." And the tower answered, not in words but in a deep, resounding hum that shook the floor beneath her. It was a heartbeat. Her heartbeat. The heartbeat of all who had come before. The tower no longer felt like stone, it felt alive, pulsing with memory and purpose. Zuri smiled through her tears. The walls that were built to silence her had instead taught her how to speak. The night the storm came, it began not with rain but with a groan from the sky, a deep rumble that seemed to crawl down the tower's spine. Zuri sat by her window listening to the wind lash against the stone, when she heard another sound, a whisper not from the walls this time but from beyond the iron bars. "Are you awake, tower girl?" The voice startled her. It was young, male and trembling as though afraid of being heard. Zuri moved closer, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. Lightning flashed, and for the briefest moment she saw a face, dark skin, rain-soaked hair, and eyes full of nervous courage. "I am always awake," she replied, her voice steady but soft. "Who are you?" The figure leaned closer, gripping the bars with gloved hands. "My name is Tano. I guard the lower gate." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I've heard stories about you all my life, that you're a curse, a ghost, or something worse. But I don't believe it. I think you're real." Zuri tilted her head, studying him. "And if I am real? Then I thought maybe you'd want to know the world hasn't forgotten you," he said, glancing over his shoulder before reaching into a small leather pouch. He pulled out scraps of parchment, half-torn pages from old books. "These are from the Royal Library, stories, poems, even maps. I can't keep them, but maybe you should have them." Zuri hesitated before taking the wet papers through the bars. The ink had bled in the rain, but she could still make out words about oceans, birds, and cities she had never seen. For someone who had lived her life between stone walls, they felt like treasures. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. Tano shrugged. "Because the people out there are dying while you're locked away. The rivers have dried. The crops rot before harvest. The king still sacrifices animals at the temple, but no rain comes. Some say the gods are angry. Others whisper that the wind has gone silent because its true voice is trapped here." Zuri's chest tightened. The wind, her oldest friend, had grown harsher these past months, its whispers restless and sharp. She had felt it pull at her hair as though urging her to listen. Now she understood why. She closed her eyes, letting the storm's rhythm seep into her. "The wind is not silent," she murmured. "It is waiting to be heard." When she spoke, the air around her window shifted. Tano stepped back, watching as the rain seemed to twist midair, spiraling around her hands. Her lips moved in a low chant, a mixture of the tower's language and her own breath. The storm responded, rolling closer, the wind howling not in anger but recognition. "What are you doing?" he whispered, all replacing fear. "Speaking," she said simply. "The wind remembers what the people have forgotten." A sudden gust swept between them, snatching one of Tano's parchments and flinging it high into the air. Instead of drifting away, it circled the tower once before vanishing into the clouds, carried by the wind itself. Tano stared, wide-eyed, his mouth half open. You control it?" Zuri smiled faintly. "No. I listen to it. And it listens back." They met many nights after that, whenever storms hid their voices from the other guards. He brought her herbs from the mountain slopes to ease her hunger, stories of rebellion whispered in taverns, and songs sung in secret by the queen's handmaidens. Each story fed her resolve, each gust of wind carried her words farther. Soon she could feel the air responding even when he was gone, shifting when she spoke, humming when she dreamed. One night, she sang a simple melody to the wind, and the next morning, a child in the city below swore she heard it carried through the rain. The kingdom was breaking, but something else was stirring, a power born of silence and storm. And at the heart of it, in her lonely tower, Zuri began to realize the truth. She was no longer the prisoner of the wind. She was becoming its messenger. The first time it happened, Zuri thought it was only the storm answering her grief. Tano had not come that night. The rain had stopped days ago, and the silence outside her window was too deep, too heavy. She sat on the cold floor, whispering the chants Amira had once taught her through the walls, but her voice cracked, breaking halfway through. The echo came back stronger than before, louder, richer, vibrating through the stones like a living thing. She froze. The torches along the stairwell outside her cell flickered, then flared, burning brighter as if her sorrow had fed them. The air around her shivered. She spoke again, deliberately this time, the sound rising from her chest instead of her lips. The stones trembled. Dust fell from the ceiling. Zuri staggered to her feet, pressing both palms against the wall. "What are you?" she whispered. The tower answered with a low hum, deep and resonant. It was not words, not yet, but she understood. It was listening. That night marked the beginning of her awakening. Every evening she experimented, speaking in tones of different pitches, humming rhythms she had once thought meaningless. When she struck the right vibration, the torches brightened, the floor rippled like a heartbeat, and the wind outside swirled as though echoing her command. Her body began to change with it. Her breathing deepened, her voice grew richer, and her ears tuned to sounds most people would never notice. The groan of distant beams, the sigh of heat in the stones, the invisible current that carried sound through air. Then one night, when the moon was full and silvered the tower's walls, the air before her shimmered. From the light stepped a figure cloaked in faint gold, translucent but regal. Her presence filled the room with a calm that pressed against Zuri's heart like warm rain. The woman's eyes glowed like molten amber, and her crown seemed woven from mist. Zuri fell to her knees, trembling. "Who are you?" she whispered. The spirit smiled, her voice soft but commanding, like the sound of wind through hollow stone. "I am Amira," she said. "The first queen who dared to speak louder than her king. They built this tower to silence me. But they did not know stone remembers. Every word, every cry, every breath, the tower drank it all. And when they brought you here, it began to wake again." Zuri's eyes widened. "You're the voice I've been hearing all these years?" "I am one of many," Amira said, moving closer until her form shimmered with light. "But it is you who called me back. You who carry what we began. You were not imprisoned, child. You were planted." Zuri felt those words root deep inside her. Planted. She thought of the endless solitude, the whispers in the walls, the wind that had always listened. None of it had been punishment, it had been preparation. Amira stretched out her hand, a ghostly palm glowing softly. "The power you feel is not the tower's alone. It is your voice and the truth within it. But you must learn to master it. Sound is both creation and destruction. A whisper can heal, a scream can tear mountains apart." From that night on, Zuri trained under Amira's watchful presence. The spirit taught her how to breathe through her diaphragm, how to use the vibrations of her bones to channel resonance, how to send her voice into stone and wind until both became extensions of herself. She learned to call wind with a hum and calm storms with a single note. She practiced in secret for weeks, her power growing stronger. When she sang, the air shimmered. When she whispered, the walls quivered. Once, when her anger slipped through her control, an entire torch stand toppled across the room, and the flames bent toward her as if bowing in respect. Amira warned her gently, "Power that answers to anger becomes a storm that devours. You must learn harmony, not dominance. The wind is not a servant, it is a mirror. It reflects what you are." Zuri listened. She began meditating at dawn, breathing in rhythm with the tower's pulse, speaking to it like an old friend. The voices of the past still murmured in the background, guiding her, reminding her of the lineage she carried. And with each passing day she could feel something blooming inside her. Not rage, not vengeance, but strength shaped by empathy and resolve. The once cold, echoing tower now felt alive, filled with warmth, light, and purpose. Her songs echoed up the stairways and out through the narrow windows, carried far beyond the hills. Some nights, villagers below swore they heard voices in the wind, soothing, powerful, ancient. Zuri no longer felt like a prisoner. She had become something far greater, a living instrument of the elements, a bridge between the silenced past and the awakening future. The sun rose over the kingdom like a trembling ember, its light veiled by clouds that refused to part. The palace courtyard was already alive with sound, drums, chants, the clang of armor as guards prepared for the grand festival of kings. It was meant to be a celebration of lineage, a ritual of power to remind the people that the king's blood still ruled, even as his body weakened and his voice faltered. But in the corners of the streets, whispers grew louder than the drums. The people had begun to speak of signs, the restless winds that howled near the tower, the strange humming that echoed from its stones at night, and the faint haunting sound of a woman's voice carried across the plains. In his throne room, the king sat slumped, his crown slightly askew. His eyes, once sharp, were now ringed with shadow. "This festival will renew their loyalty," he murmured, gripping the edge of his seat. Let them sing, let them dance, let them forget the stories of ghosts. The royal advisors exchanged wary glances. They had all heard the warnings, old prophecies buried in the temple scrolls, now being murmured again by the street prophets. When the wind speaks, kings will tremble. When silence breaks, thrones will fall. The king dismissed the omens as superstition, but fear gnawed at the edges of his authority. So he doubled the guards around the tower. Iron doors were reinforced with fresh locks, chains were oiled and tested. No sound was meant to escape. Yet as the soldiers worked, an unease crept through the air. The wind no longer moved gently, it coiled, twisted, and pressed against their armor like invisible hands. One guard swore he heard singing within the stone walls, low, mournful, and ancient. Another claimed the torches flickered in rhythm with a heartbeat. They silenced each other quickly, fearing the king's wrath more than the whispers of spirits. As the day wore on, the festival began. The streets filled with dancers painted in gold and crimson, their movements desperate to please unseen gods. Offerings were laid before the statue of the first king, but the fires refused to stay lit. Each time a priest lifted his voice, a gust of wind smothered the flame. Up in the tower, Zuri sat in the dim light, her chains cold but humming softly. She could feel the pull of the celebration below, the desperate chants, the fear, the arrogance. It all fed the current that now lived within her. The lessons from the spectral queen, Amira, echoed in her mind. Power is not given, child. It is remembered. Closing her eyes, Zuri let her breath flow into a hum, a note so soft it seemed harmless. Yet it resonated through the stone, vibrating against the metal rings that bound her. Dust drifted from the ceiling. The torches along the tower walls flared, burning blue. Down below, in the middle of the festival, dancers stumbled as the ground trembled faintly. The king rose from his seat, clutching his chest. "What is that?" he barked, but his words were lost beneath the growing howl of wind. In the hills surrounding the city, trees bent as if bowing. The tower's silhouette began to shimmer under the pale sun, a ripple of light coursing through its structure. Prophets dropped their staffs and fled, screaming, "The voice of the tower is rising." Inside, Zuri opened her eyes. Her voice had found its rhythm, her heartbeat its purpose. The festival below was meant to celebrate the king's reign, but the wind had already chosen a new ruler. And as the drums faltered and the torches sputtered out, the first crack split the base of the tower, soft as a sigh, but enough to make the kingdom shiver. The wind at last was awake. Night fell like an omen, heavy, electric, and trembling with unspoken rage. The moon was veiled behind clouds, and the air hung thick with the promise of storm. Within the tower, Zuri could feel something shift. Her heartbeat no longer echoed alone. It was answered by a rhythm beneath the stone, a pulse from the earth itself. Far below, in the shadowed courtyard, a lone figure moved carefully among the guards. Tano. His eyes darted between the torches as he carried a small satchel close to his chest. Inside were scraps of bread, a carved wooden token of the moon goddess, and a note written in trembling script. "Hold on. Freedom is near." He had brought food to Zuri before, risking his life each time, whispering hope through the cracks of the iron door. But tonight something in the air felt different, charged, dangerous. The guards were restless, their faces pale under the flickering torchlight. As Tano reached the base of the tower, a voice sliced through the night. "Stop him." He froze. The clatter of armor followed. Within seconds he was surrounded, 5 guards closing in, blades glinting. One of them held up the satchel, shaking it open. "Food for the prisoner," the man sneered. "Traitor." Tano's breath came fast. "She's not the monster you think she is. The king is the one who—" The first blow silenced him. A blade found his chest, quick and cruel. He fell to his knees, blood staining the dirt as thunder cracked far above. His last breath was a whisper carried by the wind. "Zuri, you are not alone." The air stilled for a heartbeat. Then it screamed. A gale surged across the courtyard, throwing guards to the ground. Torches shattered, scattering sparks that died before touching the earth. Inside the tower, Zuri felt the instant it happened. The thread that had tethered her to the world outside snapped, replaced by something raw, consuming, and wild. Her eyes flew open, glowing faintly with a light not of this world. The voice of Queen Amira echoed around her, soft but trembling with ancient power. "The blood of loyalty is the key. Grief is the hammer. Break the silence, child." Zuri's scream tore from her throat, pure and resonant. It wasn't human, it was the cry of every silenced woman who had ever lived, every forgotten queen whose name had been erased. The sound slammed against the walls, splitting stone, shaking iron, awakening centuries of buried power. Lightning flashed across the sky. The tower glowed from within, each crack alive with blue fire. The chains around Zuri's wrists rattled violently, lifting as if alive. They resisted for a moment, then shattered into molten fragments that dissolved into air. Outside, soldiers fled in terror. The wind had turned black, twisting into columns that carried whispers and faces of women, countless and ethereal, their eyes burning with justice. The spirits of the past had risen, answering the call of one of their own. Within the tower, Zuri stood now at the center of a storm made of memory and fury. Her tears streamed down her face, but where they fell, the ground bloomed with light. "Amira," she whispered through the roar, "I can feel them, all of them." "Then speak their names," the Spirit Queen replied, her form shimmering in the stormlight. "Let the world remember what it tried to forget." Zuri lifted her hands, palms facing the walls that had once been her cage. Her voice rose, not in rage but in lamentation. She sang in a language older than the kingdom, older than kings, older than silence. Each note struck the air like thunder. Each word summoned another spirit, another echo of pain transfigured into strength. The stones themselves began to hum, vibrating with the resonance of her song. The tower could no longer contain her. A final bolt of lightning struck its crown, and the top exploded outward, releasing a column of wind that spiraled into the heavens. The glow illuminated the entire kingdom, roofs, temples, and the trembling palace where the king watched in horror. From the shattered heights descended Zuri. Her chains had become threads of light that coiled around her arms like living symbols. Her hair flowed in the stormwind, her eyes burning with storm fire and sorrow. The air around her shimmered with spirits, warriors, queens, mothers, daughters, each carrying the weight of their stories in silence no longer. The guards who dared to look upon her fell to their knees, unable to breathe. For they did not see a prisoner, they saw a goddess reborn in grief and thunder. As Zuri's feet touched the earth, the storm seemed to bow. The winds curved around her, waiting for command. Every whisper, every echo, every unspoken cry now lived in her breath. Amira's voice lingered one last time, soft as the wind's sigh. "You were not broken, child. You were tempered." Zuri looked up at the tower, now split open like a seed. Rain poured through the gaps, washing away dust and blood. The stones glowed faintly in the darkness, alive with the memory of what they had witnessed. Her gaze shifted toward the palace. In the distance, lightning crawled across the sky like veins of fate. She could hear the panicked bells, the shouts, the fear spreading through the city that had built her cage. And beneath it all, she could feel the hum, the pulse of power that no longer hid. The storm was not above her. It was her. Zuri stepped forward, each stride steady, her chains now melted into light trailing behind her like a royal mantle. The spirits followed in her wake, whispering blessings. Tomorrow the festival would still come. But the crown would no longer rest on the head of a man. The wind had chosen its queen. The storm had not ended, it had simply followed her. As dawn broke, the clouds hung low and bruised over the kingdom, trembling with the weight of something sacred. From the shattered tower on the hill, Zuri descended, barefoot, her feet touching the wet grass like anointing oil upon the land. The wind curled around her as if greeting its queen, carrying the scent of rain and iron, of endings and beginnings. Behind her, the tower still glowed faintly, a wounded monument reborn, whispering the hymns of the women who had once been entombed within its walls. Their voices rose and fell like a chorus, soft, eternal, mournful, and proud. Every gust of wind that swept down the hill carried their song, wrapping around Zuri like a cloak woven from the breath of ancestors. As she walked, people began to gather along the winding path. Farmers, soldiers, widows, and children, all drawn by the sound that resonated through the air, neither thunder nor voice but both. They saw her coming and gasped. Her skin shimmered faintly, lit by a light that came from within. Her eyes burned with calm purpose, her hair dancing in the wind that bowed before her. Someone whispered, trembling, "The voice of the tower." Another fell to their knees. Then another. Soon, the road down the hill became a sea of bowed heads and tear-streaked faces. None dared to speak above a whisper, for they felt, not saw, that this was no mere woman returning. This was prophecy walking. Zuri paused as she reached the edge of the royal city. The great gates that once barred her path now groaned open by unseen force, their hinges screaming like guilty hearts. The guards who had locked her away years ago dropped their weapons, their armor clattering against the stone like confessions. Within the palace courtyard, the king stood trembling. The years had carved fear into his face. His once proud crown sat crooked, heavy with guilt. His eyes darted toward the sky, where lightning still coiled like serpents. When he saw Zuri, his knees weakened. "Stay back," he hissed, his voice cracking. Guards, stop her." But no one moved. Even the air refused his command. Zuri's gaze met his, steady, unblinking. The winds around her pulsed softly, responding to her breath. She did not shout or threaten. She simply spoke, her voice carrying like thunder across the courtyard. "You locked me away to silence the wind," she said. "But you cannot cage what was born to move." The king took a step back, shaking his head. "You are cursed. You bring ruin." Zuri's expression softened, almost pitying. "No, father. I bring the truth. And the truth is not ruin, it is release." As she raised her hand, the storm above the palace stirred violently. A bolt of lightning split the sky, striking the golden spire of the throne hall. The sound that followed was not mere thunder, it was a roar, the cry of centuries breaking open. The king stumbled, clutching his chest. His crown, gleaming and fragile, cracked down the middle, splitting with a sound like glass shattering in the soul of the kingdom. The people gasped. The golden emblem tumbled from his head, rolling down the palace steps until it came to rest at Zuri's feet. For a long moment she stared at it, the symbol of fear, of control, of silence. Then she bent, not to wear it but to lift it in her hands. When she spoke again, her voice carried the echo of countless others. "This is not mine to rule with. It is ours to rebuild." The wind circled her, and the voices of the dead queens rose in harmony. The storm softened into light rain, washing the blood and dust from the courtyard. The people lifted their heads, watching as Zuri stepped through the great doors of the palace. She moved not as a conqueror, but as balance restored, each step a beat in the heart of a new dawn. Inside the grand hall, the tapestries that once told tales of kings and wars fluttered and fell. The great mirrors cracked, reflecting not one ruler, but 1,000 faces of those who had been unseen. Zuri placed the broken crown upon the throne, not as a claim but as an offering. "Let this kingdom remember," she whispered, "that silence is not peace. And chains, no matter how golden, still bind." The air shimmered. The wind bowed low, kneeling as if the world itself had chosen her. And as sunlight pierced through the last remnants of the storm, it crowned her, not with gold but with light. Zuri did not sit on the throne that day. She stood beside it, a queen not of conquest but of reckoning. The people outside began to chant her name, not as worship, but as awakening. And when the echoes reached the hill where the tower stood reborn, the stones themselves seemed to sigh with relief. Finally, the prophecy had not just been fulfilled. It had been freed. Seasons passed, and the storm that had once torn through the kingdom gave way to calm skies and soft rains. The air no longer trembled with fear but hummed with quiet renewal. The tower on the hill, once a monument of punishment and silence, stood again, rebuilt from its ruins not by royal command but by willing hands. Women young and old climbed the winding path each morning, carrying stones, herbs, and scrolls. They worked with laughter, prayers, and songs instead of chains. Where soldiers once patrolled, gardens now bloomed. Vines climbed the tower's sides, weaving through cracks like veins of new life. The old walls, still marked by scorch and stormlight, were left untouched in some places, as reminders of what had been and what must never return. Zuri stood before the renewed tower, the wind playing gently with her robes. She no longer wore gold or jewels. Around her neck hung a pendant made of iron and clay, the same materials that once bound her, now reshaped into a symbol of transformation. Behind her, the voices of builders and children mingled with the whisper of the breeze, creating a new rhythm for the kingdom. The people had begun to call it the House of Echoes, a name chosen not by decree but by collective heart. It was a sanctuary, a place where women came not to be forgotten but to be found. Healers from distant villages came to share their knowledge of herbs and breath. Storytellers came to record the tales of the silenced. And those born under strange omens or storms, girls like Zuri, came to learn that their gifts were blessings, not curses. Inside the tower's main chamber, Zuri taught them to listen. She would stand before the open window, her eyes half closed, and speak softly. "The wind remembers," she'd say. "It carries what is spoken and what is meant. If you listen not with your ears but with your chest, it will answer." The children would close their eyes and imitate her. Some swore they could hear laughter from centuries past, or songs carried by women who had once been imprisoned here. Others said the tower hummed softly at night as if dreaming. And perhaps it was. The language of echoes, as they called it, became a sacred art, half meditation, half communication. It was said that the wind could carry truth between hearts, that lies could not survive within its current. Villagers began using it in their gatherings, speaking truthfully before one another and letting the wind judge their sincerity. Slowly, deceit withered from the court and wisdom took its place. Zuri never declared herself a queen again. She ruled instead as a guardian of voices. Those who sought her counsel found not commands but questions. Those who came with sorrow left with strength. On certain nights, when the moon hung low and the wind turned silver, she would climb to the tower's highest chamber. There, she would light a single lantern and sit among the stones that had once been her prison. She would whisper to them, not in words but in feeling. Gratitude, forgiveness, resolve. And sometimes if one listened closely the stones would answer. Not in human speech but in a soft, steady hum, a resonance of memory. One evening as twilight painted the horizon, a young girl approached her, clutching a scroll. "Mother Zuri," she said shyly, "they say the tower speaks only to you." Zuri smiled, her eyes kind. "No, child," she replied. "It speaks to anyone who dares to listen." The wind stirred, carrying her words beyond the hill, through the fields and homes, until they reached every corner of the kingdom. And in that breath of air the people knew, the tower had been reborn, not of stone but of spirit. Where once there was fear there was now a voice. Where once there was silence there was truth. You said. Years turned to decades and the story of the tower became legend. The kingdom that had once lived under the weight of silence now breathed freely beneath open skies. The wind that once carried cries and storms now moved gently through the villages, singing lullabies to sleeping children. In every marketplace, in every corner of the land, people spoke of the woman who had changed the course of their fate, the Wind Queen. They said her voice could calm storms and wake seeds buried too deep in the earth. When tempests gathered over the plains, people would open their windows and whisper her name, Zuri, and the thunder would soften as if the sky itself remembered her. When fields dried in the heat, they would sing the chants she had once taught in the tower, and the rain would come. Her voice had become more than sound, it was woven into the breath of the world. The tower still stood upon the hill, weathered by time yet untouched by decay. At night, travelers passing through swore they could hear a low hum rising from its stones, a rhythm like a heartbeat. Some said it was the wind slipping through the cracks, others believed it was Zuri's spirit, still walking among her people, teaching through the whispers of air. Pilgrims came from far kingdoms to see the place where the Wind Queen had lived. Some brought offerings of carved feathers or jars of storm water, others simply came to sit in silence, hoping to hear the echoes that had once shaped destiny. Those who listened with sincerity often felt the faintest brush of wind against their cheeks, carrying a warmth that was not of weather but of remembrance. Inside the tower, her teachings remained etched into the walls, simple lines carved by hand. The wind listens. The walls remember. Silence is not weakness. Children recited these words as part of their lessons, their small voices filling the hall where Zuri had once stood. The language of echoes lived on. Mothers taught it to their daughters not as magic, but as a way of hearing the world and understanding its truth. In the fields, women spoke to the breeze before planting seeds. In the courts, rulers paused to feel the wind before making judgment. Even kings learned to listen. And yet, not all who came to the tower sought wisdom. Some came out of ambition, rulers who wished to command the elements, sorcerers who hoped to steal the Wind Queen's secret. But the tower offered them nothing. For it did not answer greed. It only spoke to those who came in humility, those who understood that power was not in possession but in purpose. On the anniversary of her passing, the people gathered at the base of the hill. They lit lanterns shaped like spirals and released them into the air, watching as the wind carried them high. From the valley below, it looked as though the stars themselves had descended to honor her. An old woman stood among the crowd, her gray hair tangled with beads and feathers. She had once been one of Zuri's pupils, a girl who learned to listen to the echoes. As the lanterns lifted, she whispered the words that had become the kingdom's most sacred proverb. What they build to contain you may become the throne that defines you. The wind caught her words and carried them upward. The crowd fell silent as a sudden breeze swept through the hill, circling the tower before descending into the fields. It moved through every home, every heart, soft and sure, as if Zuri herself walked once more among her people. And though generations would come and go, the legend of the Wind Queen never faded. She had not left behind an empire of stone or gold, but something far greater, an empire of breath, memory, and truth. And when storms gathered once more over the horizon, the people did not fear. They listened. And in the low hum of the wind, they always heard her voice.